Okay, yeah, let's just
You know more about it than I do because you.
Whoa. It's like fruit bugs in here attacking me.
Get them.
We have literally spawned a new species of fly in our office.
Yeah.
That's what happens when you have only men in an office.
The UI bug.
Welcome to the EmberMap podcast, where we talk about design and development in the world of Ember.js. I'm Sam.
I'm Ryan.
And if you like what you hear today, you can find more of our work on embermap.com. So how's your week been going?
Good. Mostly Ember. All Ember, in fact.
Mostly Ember?
Yeah, all Ember.
You did a little Rails.
A little Rails last night.
Went pretty quick.
Yeah.
Back to Ember.
Yeah. Rails is always the fast side. Most of my time in Ember.
So one of the things we want to talk about today was when I brought down the site a couple weeks ago, which happens on the regs, I would say.
Once a month.
So I pushed some code and something broke. I don't even remember what it was at this point.
Yeah, I remember it was, I never forget. We had a environment variable in our config environment.js file that was set in development. It was set in test. It was not set in production.
Right.
So in dev mode, everything worked fine.
Test suite passed.
But then as soon as we built the app and deployed it, it didn't run. You get that white screen because there was an initializer that asserted against that variable it's not set, and the app doesn't boot.
Was that Stripe?
Yeah, I think it was Stripe. So I think we had not set our public key in the production environment.
Right. And that's interesting. That led to, we talked about this for a while because there's kind of a lot there, right? There's the fact that you've installed an add-on that can break your site. Mm-hmm. So for a lot of people who aren't subscribing, like the app from their perspective would have worked perfectly if Stripe wasn't working at all, right? So that's basically a part of our site that's not working, which is namely like subscribing, right? Because that's the part of our site that uses Stripe. But the rest of the site works.
Right. So you're saying that even though the app didn't boot, the app could have booted.
And worked for 99% of what people are using it for.
Yes.
So there's like that whole idea of graceful degradation or parts of your app that can be resistant to failure and not take down your entire app.
Right.
So it's like maybe that add-on shouldn't have...
It shouldn't
block the app from working.
Right. So I think the intention here is, you're in dev mode and it wants to stop your app. It wants to let you know that this add-on doesn't, you haven't configured this add-on right. You should go configure it.
Right.
The problem is you can configure it for dev mode, but not for production mode.
Right. So then that's the next part of this, which is like you have a test suite, you've developed a feature and it works, but your app is broken in production. So what's going on there? There's a lot of layers, right? You have tests, you have config that lives outside of tests or that changes from one environment to the next.
Yeah. So I think, hindsight's 2020, right? But I think we would want, and I'll make this change in the Stripe.
Because you've worked on this add-on.
I work on the Stripe add-on, so it's my fault. Okay, even though it was your fault, it's my fault.
Good.
But Stripe, what does Stripe want? Stripe wants you, or the Stripe add-on wants you to configure it with your key. And the answer to there isn't to stop the app from booting, but maybe some build time or dev time check that says, I see you have these 3 environments, 2 of them have a key, 1 doesn't. You should probably fix this.
Right. Right. Because you could know that just from when you try to build the app in production or something.
Yeah. So what would you do? You would import config environment, and then you would basically make sure the key is set for dev, test, and production.
Or even you could just, within the add-on, there's probably a broccoli hook that's like after I've run, before I'm going to do all my work, run an assertion at compile time against the config variable that you end up with. Because that could change in a lot of ways. That configuration could. You
have more add-on experience than I do. So would you do this in the add-ons index file? But it's going
to be one of the hooks, after all the trees have been processed, because there's been questions with Mirage about this where you have add-ons or engines configuring Mirage and then getting loaded into a host app. And the host app is going to kind of read the configs from all of the children and then like read it into one config. And then, so I think you'd want to make sure all of that process is finished. And then you look at the final environment variables or the configuration that gets passed to your add-on. And it's probably there's probably some post something hook in Broccoli where you can say, all right, I'm done with all of my manipulation. Now I'm going to initialize. And then we could write assertions against that.
And what do you, if you, let's say something is wrong, you just throw?
I think I think you would throw, so that would be a compile time error. So you wouldn't even, okay. You could just, so that would be, seems like at a high level that's how I would approach it.
Right. And this in the Stripe case, it even prevents you from even deploying a broken app to production.
Right. Because if you try to build it, so the test would have still passed.
Yep.
That's actually interesting. Dev would have worked. Fine. But then when it went to deploy it,
it wouldn't have worked.
So there would have been a problem with your deploy and you wouldn't have deployed the broken app.
Yeah.
So that seems like a right move to me. This kind of leads to something else we've talked about in the past, which is just like a best practice that we've kind of learned over our time as developers, which is just that you want to have your local app as resembling your production app as much as possible.
Yeah.
In basically every facet. And that seems like something that's maybe easy, but when you actually kind of pull back the layers, there's a lot there, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, I think I guess I was kind of going to ask you about if you had some knowledge from working with Rails in the past when people used to use like SQLite, and then it was like, no, really you want to get MySQL or Postgres running on your machine. So again, you're doing as much as possible similar.
Yeah. I mean, it's tricky because using SQLite in your test environment is nice because it's fast.
Mm-hmm.
You don't need to set everything up. It's just a file. Mm-hmm. It's going to work on everyone else's computer. But now, it's like you said, your dev and your testing or production environment are now using two different database implementations. And that's probably going to cause an issue. And if you've worked on any Rails app for a couple of years, you always end up with something database specific.
UTF-8 encoding.
Yeah. Or like even on EmberMap, which is a Rails app, we use HStore for something. It's a key value column type in Postgres. So this wouldn't even run in SQLite.
Right.
So you always want to look for these little things. I mean, that one's a big one, but you always want to look and make sure your test environment, your dev environment, especially your staging environment, are as close to production as possible.
Right, staging because it's
kind of like the final check.
You're not going to incur as many developer time slowdowns and complexities from your daily development because you're not developing on staging, but it is a last check.
And staging also, like when you're developing locally, you're not like deploying the app.
Right.
So there's no real test or no real feedback for deployment. So that's why staging is helpful too.
Staging is basically going to exercise your deployment strategy.
Yeah. It's going to it's like a dry run for what's about to go into production.
Right. That's good. And so like what are the kinds of things in Ember apps that you have to deal with or that we've had to deal with a lot that are different? So, different origins that you're deploying to.
Yep.
That's something that can affect all sorts of things. API locations.
Definitely speed. I
mean,
when you're developing an Ember app locally, you're talking to usually a backend running on your computer.
Yep.
And that, the difference between, 40 and 400 milliseconds can completely change a UI.
Right.
So I think that's something I've noticed.
That's interesting. Yeah. Something you wouldn't necessarily think about as a factor that's changing from one environment to the next, but that actually ends up maybe having a non-trivial effect on how you would develop the app.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. You might think like, oh, maybe I should use a loading template here.
Right. Loading template, paginate, or something like that. Yeah. But other things are like
that's cores. Data, right? Your dev environment usually has far less data than your production environment. So pagination.
Right. You wouldn't even maybe build it and then you load it up and now you have a table with 1,000 records or something.
Yeah.
Cores and all of those things that have to do with, which is unfortunately hard to really standardize on because deployment of Ember apps is just, it changes. I mean, it's different in a lot of different ways, right?
Yeah.
So, but I think that's a good principle and it's good to always think about if you are writing an add-on or you're writing the app in a way that's going to how can you make it resilient, right? And there's just all these pieces there. I think add-ons are probably the most, people just usually install add-ons and are trying to get, people who are install add-ons are trying to get something done as fast as possible. So they're going to install the add-on and use it. And as an add-on author, it's good to make sure that when people do use your add-on like that, which is probably how people use add-ons 80 to 90% of the time, instead of like tweaking the initializer, right? Or looking at the config, reading it through the entire README, that it doesn't break down the entire app unless it's absolutely critical.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So
let's talk about, in this case, like how did we...
What do we do?
Yeah, what do we do? So you push a broken Ember build to production. How do you know it's broken?
So I'm trying to remember what happened. I think I had gotten in the office before you that day and I pushed it and it broke. I think I'm trying to remember if we had, so we have Slack notifications for endpoints that don't work or are slow or break. But I think I actually just tried to visit the site, which is another interesting thing when we talk about, how do we know when our app is correct and working? And usually we say the test pass, deploy it, works. But I always find myself visiting the site, which is kind of an interesting, it's a tell in some sense that I'm really confident that my new deploy works once I see it live on EmberMap.com, let's say. So I think I pulled it up and it was white. And I realized I broke something and it wasn't something that I knew right away what it was. So in our case, what I did was I went to the Heroku app for our front end. So we serve our back end off a Heroku app and then our front end off a separate Heroku app. And I just clicked the rollback button. There's like a list of deploys and the last one was a few days before. So I just clicked rollback. And then within a few minutes, it was back to working.
Pretty awesome.
Yeah. Really awesome. Also because that's the same way we roll back our Rails app when I break it.
Yeah, one interface.
Yeah, exactly. So, Heroku is obviously it's like a paid product and it can get expensive. For us, it's absolutely perfect. And having both those on separate apps has worked out really well. I mean, we used to not do that, but it's worked out really well for us so far.
Yeah, and fast boot is a thing that moved us.
That's right.
To separate apps because we need an instance of a server running.
Right. So having the rollback built in was great. If we didn't have that, basically you want a way to roll back because, that's important.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's a lot of times where I worked on apps that didn't have that ability.
Right.
And
you also want to know that you have a way to roll back before you get in a spot where the site is down.
Right.
Because that's, you want to be calm and cool when that happens.
Right.
So it's good if you're working on an app and you haven't rolled it back in a month, go do a deploy and roll it back.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
And Ember apps aren't that, well, I mean, UIs and CSS and JavaScript, it's easier to roll that back than like a backend app that's heavy on like database migrations and all that stuff.
Right.
Now, the one exception here is like API endpoints. If your API endpoints change, it's a lot harder to roll back.
In a backwards incompatible way, you're saying.
Yeah. So.
Right. So that's an interesting thing. Usually we don't always do this. Sometimes we just accept a little bit of downtime, let's say. But if we had enough traffic, and we were making change to both backend and the front end, and the new front end code needed a new backend code, then we try to write the backend change in a backwards compatible way so we could deploy it first.
It works with version 1 and version 2.
Right.
Deploy it. So
then deploy the front end.
Front end's running version 1, works with the new backend. Then deploy the front end. It's running version 2, works with the new backend.
Yep. And that way you could roll it back if something happened with the front end. Although if you need to roll back the back end, I guess you'd also have to roll the front end back as well.
Yes.
If you didn't find out that there was something wrong with it until later.
There's a nice talk from RailsConf a couple of years ago about zero downtime deploys.
And it still applies with all of this architecture.
Same idea. It's instead of front end, back end, it's back end and database, or Rails app and database. And
if you need to migrate your database in a way that's not backwards compatible.
A backwards compatible migration, exactly.
Gotcha.
So it's a trade-off, though, because this takes a lot more testing, a lot more dev time. And, when it's just the two of us, we want to ship a feature.
Right.
And if the site is down, well, we can deal with it being down.
Right.
But yeah, definitely on bigger apps, mission-critical apps, this is stuff you need to consider.
Yeah. And then what about our, error notifications and alerts and things like that.
Yeah. So it's you kind of said earlier, like, that the code is working when you visit it, but like that's not even enough for me.
Right.
Like if I deploy something and let's say it like sends an email, I want to see that thing send like 1,000 emails, and then I know it's working.
Right.
Once it's like been stress tested in the real
Right.
world.
So there's a notion of some sampling
Yeah.
that has to happen before you are confident that you can move on to the next thing, let's say.
Yep. And I've worked on apps before where they run off like 6 or 7 different app servers. So we'll deploy code to like one of the app servers. And so it's getting, 1 out of 7 of the requests from the load balancer. And then when that looks good, we'll deploy it to 2 and then, 4 and then all of them.
And that way, if there's a problem in the first one,
we just end up taking that.
And the majority of the
pool.
Users never saw it because they were using the old version of the app.
Yeah. It's easy to, there's not even a rollback mechanism. We just pull it right out of the pool. So that now we're from 7 to 6 servers. So that's worked really well.
That's really cool.
Yeah. But yeah, error. Sorry, you were talking about.
Right. So going back to error reporting.
Yeah, that's another big one. Like, how do you know your site's working? Well,
Right.
when you're not, when your Slack channel isn't blowing up with errors from your backend.
Right.
So error monitoring is really important.
And there's other things like if we typically get, 5 subscriptions a week, and then it's been 3 weeks with no subscriptions.
We know something's wrong.
On either the business front or the technology front. So that's kind of the idea of like passive monitoring to make sure your apps are working.
Yeah, absolutely. Some sort of event dashboard that
Right.
you can monitor.
Right. And it's hard, in this new world that we're in where we have multiple apps now, you really need monitoring on both sides, right? Because your backend and your front end can go down for different reasons. Fast boot could crash your front end server, your database server could crash your backend. So
And a lot of times there's just, there's errors that are generated from your apps that aren't really errors. So like someone has a Chrome extension and that starts throwing JavaScript errors on your page. And now your error collector is loaded with all these just things that aren't errors that you don't even want to know about.
right.
And same goes for backend. I think we have alerts on like high response times.
Right.
And occasionally we'll just get one that's just totally out of,
Like a bot is making it or something like that.
yeah. And if we're going to ignore it, why do we have an alert? It's just, it kind of takes away from all the other alerts.
Right.
But then we want to know about it. And I guess we could come up with rules like if this happens 10 times in a minute, but
It's tough.
Yeah.
At one of my first programming jobs, they did a lot of overnight processing of like text data files, and they made like an internal monitoring web page, and they call it Christmas tree because it basically was like green and red, and if it was red, it was bad. But they just kept adding monitors and alerts, and it just kept going. And everyone learned to ignore it. But there were like a few things that people knew to look for. But you would just visit Christmas tree, and you would just see a bunch of green and red. So I think the goal is not to have your monitoring and reporting get to that state, because then it's basically useless.
It's like if you ever have an email rule to like auto archive or auto move all your monitoring alerts,
Right.
It's time to rethink.
I remember about a week after you started setting those things up. That's tricky though. That's good though.
Yeah, so there's a lot. I mean, back to the question, how do we know when the site's working? It's like tests, monitoring, like business metrics.
Right. I mean, shoot, this even goes to like Netflix's whole Chaos Monkey thing where they know it's working if, they randomly take down 10% of their servers so that they make sure the rest of the systems are resilient. You've heard about that?
Yeah.
So that's even beyond that.
Yeah, and a whole nother layer of testing.
A whole nother layer of testing of resilience. So, many layers here.
Yeah.
So, we're running 2 trainings this year at EmberConf.
Yeah, we did 2 last year, and we're going to do 2 again this year.
We did 2 last year. We stayed up all night and got sick for about 10 days, so we figured why not do it again?
Well, the all-nighter wasn't the trainings. The all-nighter was the
Glimmer video.
The Glimmer video, yeah.
It was probably in combination. It was a 1-2 punch to our bodies. Worked out all well, though. It was a lot of fun. And so, so this year we're doing... What are we doing?
We're
doing
doing
styles.
Styles, yeah. So
And we're doing Mirage.
Specifically functional CSS.
Right. Functional CSS.
And then, yeah, like advanced Mirage techniques and...
Yep. Yeah. And that'll be nice because that'll piggyback off of some of the Mirage videos we're releasing right now for our current series on Mirage. But yeah, the functional CSS, I guess we haven't spoken a ton about. Maybe one of the earlier episodes we did talk about it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I recently spent some time working on the styles in EmberMap after coming off some consulting work, and it was pretty interesting to see. EmberMap is only a year and a half old, and to see what we were doing way back then.
Way back then, yeah.
Versus kind of what we learned on our last few consulting projects that we built, because we're starting to carry these principles over. Same with the data loading stuff,
This is probably one of the things that changes the most for us is our view on CSS and styles and yeah.
Yep. But at the same time, looking at where we were and where I wanted to go, it was like it feels like a refinement. So
absolutely. I don't feel like we're guessing.
Right. It's not like a superficial. We don't come across something and then it's like functional CSS is great, and then all of a sudden it's like this other thing is great.
There are iterations on functional CSS.
Yep. I think one thing I've learned from some of my recent work with it is, when you first learn about functional CSS, and I guess maybe we should just talk a little bit about it for folks who aren't familiar, but the idea is, I guess it's becoming more common because even Bootstrap now has all these utility classes, right? If you want to text a line left something, there's just a single class that does that and does only that. It's nice because it doesn't interfere with other styles. You don't have to define a new rule for it. It's already there. So that's really nice. And when you first come across functional CSS, you can move pretty quick doing this. You don't have to write CSS a lot of times. And even things like padding sizes and font sizes and colors, you're working with a limited set. Whereas when you open a CSS file, it's kind of overwhelming because you can just go to town.
Right.
So that's really nice. And that's what we did initially, was basically all using these functional classes. And then it kind of quickly becomes apparent when you look at an application, and a lot of this is not new. This is just, borrowing ideas from, my first thought is like Atomic Design, where he identifies these 5 different layers. I think I want to start with 2, which is just a simpler way to think about it, right? Mm-hmm. It's like if you looked at a website, twitter.com, and you needed to break it down, you could say that there's things like Twitter blue or Twitter red for colors. There's spacing, there's maybe let's say there's 4 or 5 button sizes. And so those use 4 or 5 padding varieties. And there's typography choices, there's headings, there's text. Those are very low level. And then higher level are how those lower level utilities combine together, because you can't just use any of those. Even though those lower level things are limited, mm-hmm. you can't combine them in any way you want.
Right. You don't want a button with H1.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. So you can't use H1 in a button. So the question then becomes, how do you guide what's the appropriate way to compose these things together and make a consistent interface? And I think that the answer to that question comes to this notion of a design language, where you define things at a very high level, and you can just look at something like twitter.com and say, I see like a floating panel. The feed is like all these floating panels together. There's kind of like another floating panel as a sidebar. There's a header. There's buttons. And in my opinion, if you're looking at that interface and that's how you're talking about it, that's as much as you want your actual code to resemble it as well.
Right.
So if I'm saying this page has a kind of a floating card here, the heading is this, the title is this, when you go to develop it, that's what you want to be thinking about. You want to be working at that level of abstraction. You don't want to be saying, all right, I need a floating card. What's the padding? What's the margin? What's this? And what's this, right? So it's like these 2 separate layers. And, in some of the apps we've worked on, I feel like we've gotten it really, like we've nailed it, and it feels really good when it works, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially for me, who I don't like writing CSS. So if I just have a component where I can just say floating card, and it works, and it's perfectly styled, and it composes with everything else on the page, it's huge.
Yeah. So that led us to kind of make these UI components, where the idea there was, we're using functional classes to build up these higher level UI components. And ideally, you're in the application layer, you're building your pieces of your interface using UI components and UI components only. I mean, like, that's the ideal, right?
Yeah. I like, another point I like is when I'm working at a feature level, I want to talk about the feature as I would talk to like a user of the application. So click that floating card, open that panel, fill in that form. And that's kind of, that tells me that when I'm coding the feature, I want to be thinking at that level about those things. So I don't want to be thinking about like, 3 nested divs that and 3 class names like panel outer, panel header, panel inner.
Right.
So I really like these UI components because the feature that I'm building lines up with the code that I'm writing, or the UI that I'm building. My code looks at how someone would describe that feature to me.
Right. Yeah, and this what you just described actually is that like that drives a lot of our coding practices elsewhere, right? Both in code and application and also in testing. You want to hit the right level of abstraction. So you want your test to read the way you would talk to a person. And even in coding, if I'm describing the logic of something and there's something lower level that's important to it, but it's not at the right level of abstraction of a method or some controller prop, something like that, you would pull that away and make it more meaningfully named.
Yep.
So that another person who's reading this can just read it. So it's the same idea, right? You want to look at an interface, you want to peek under the hood of an interface and see these UI components. That's going to make it easier to understand and change.
Yep.
There's also a lot of constraints when you use this approach, because if your developers are used to building interfaces out of UI components instead of raw HTML and raw CSS, then there's a lot of constraints there and they're very freeing, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, take BEM. BEM, you can just go in and you can add any padding. And that's hard because someone looks at your design or looks at the feature you just built and says, hey, can you add some spacing there?
Right.
And you're like, yeah, sure, I can. You don't really have a good way to say no, or it's
we use padding 15 everywhere else on our app. Yeah. Why are we using padding 13 here?
But if you're using these functional CSS classes and that's all you can use, then basically the answer to that question is no.
Right. So it's good constraints, and it also helps you kind of start a conversation with your design team or with other developers about, what do we want here? What do we want to allow? And what don't we want to allow? And
when we change something, so say we do want more spacing, when we do add more spacing, how does that affect the rest of the site?
Right.
And that's because that's a thing you need to consider with these design things.
Exactly. Yeah, what's interesting is as I've been thinking more about this and working on this approach, we usually say things. One of the things we say about Ember that's good is that it's familiar. It uses templates. Sorry. One thing we say about Ember templates that's good is that they're familiar. And, I haven't worked on a React team, but I have seen people talk about it's, the fact that a designer or someone without as much JavaScript experience, they have a hard time opening a React component, looking at the render function and like making a change to a style. Whereas if you have a template and a CSS file, like anyone who knows HTML and CSS can do it, even if they don't know JavaScript, even if they don't know data fetching, architecture experience, all this stuff. But since working on this stuff, it's kind of interesting to think like, okay, yes, HTML is familiar and CSS is familiar. HTML only has 20-something tags. Like everyone knows CSS, or everyone can do some CSS.
Everyone knows
right, exactly.
CSS, yeah.
Exactly. But if you were to jump into a team with a mature app and you were to add a feature that uses something like, a collapsible panel or even a button or some text, chances are you're not using a p tag and writing CSS. Maybe you're using a p tag and using some classes, but if you're using classes, you need to know what those classes are. Mm-hmm. Just because you're familiar with HTML and CSS doesn't mean you can intuit
what some front-end developer named the class 3 years ago.
Exactly. So already there's a step where you're referencing something, and that step is constraining you as a developer into what you're allowed to put in the app, right? And if it's getting reviewed, someone who knows the app is going to say, yeah, that matches or that doesn't match. So I feel like with these UI components where I've talked about them with some folks at like a meetup, and it's kind of like, well, why do we need like a UI text or a UI title when we have an H1 and a P. But again, it's really about that step already happens. So how can we wrap that step up, make it super apparent and evident? And, if everyone did use UI text or something very basic like that was configurable, then you would know how to build these pages without knowing the implementations.
So your argument is someone says, why do I have to use UI title? I already have H1. And you would say, well, you don't already have H1 because what you have is H1 class equals
right.
something.
Right. Exactly. Yep. So why not accept that fact and take it head on and say, okay, the way we're building our UIs is not using these building blocks are awesome. The fact that components are built using HTML and CSS is great because now anyone can make a component, and components are super powerful. They can be reused. You can limit their APIs to what's just necessary. So when I'm working on a component, I want to use HTML and CSS because I know what to do with that. But when I'm adding a feature to an application that exists, that has a design language, that has a look and feel to it, a brand, I don't want raw HTML and CSS, basically.
Right. You want the component, the constraint.
Exactly.
Yeah. So how do you deal with? Okay. So say we buy this.
Okay.
Well, I have 30 links and 15 paragraphs and 4 titles on this page. So what is that? That's like 49 different components now have to render. Or am I going to take a performance hit? Like, wouldn't it be so much easier to use P tags?
So yeah, this is another thing that comes up when I talk about this. And again, I'm not saying this is my idea. There's other people who've done this, but I just really have taken on to this strongly recently. And so when I have talked with other folks about this, that is one of the things they say. You're incurring the cost of a component render just to get some text on the screen. So first, my response would be, I think if that's your only qualm with it, then I've won the battle. Like, I've won you over because you realize that's not the important part, right? It's almost like that mantra of do it right and then do it fast. Where if you're refactoring, like, you think about performance later. It's kind of like premature optimization, right? It's kind of all of these things wrapped into one. So there's a couple things here. One is, like, we've done this on a lot of apps and it hasn't been a performance problem for us personally, but obviously in some apps it could. I imagine, especially if you had like lots of tables, rows, and each cell was a component, and those things, you could really go bananas there.
Which, by the way, I do in one of our apps. Every table cell is a component. It's all contextual components. So you table as table, table.row, table.cell.
Which is great to work with.
Yeah.
So if performance was a concern, there's a couple ideas we've had here. Miguel Cambra has worked on this add-on that lets you create what's called a build time component, which, with some constraints over what parts of the Ember component API you're able to use, will turn an Ember component invocation in your template, and it will turn it into HTML and CSS. So let's say you did something like UI-P or UI-text, let's say, and you passed in style equals blue. And then in your implementation of UI text, you said tag name is P. So normally when you render the Ember component, it would use the P tag instead of a div. And then you have some logic that's like style. When style is blue, I want to add the classes BLUE and like hover dark blue. Mm-hmm. So really all this is doing is like giving you that nice constrained API, but you're really just outputting HTML and CSS. So there's a way to make a build time component such that after your project builds, if you were to pop open that template, it would actually just be a P with the 2 classes in it.
And so now you don't pay the render cost.
You literally incur no render cost, no component instantiation cost. I mean, that's it. And so obviously, Ember components do lots more than just render HTML tags and CSS classes.
Right. So I'd imagine you would lose did receive adders if you did this.
Exactly. There's hooks that you would lose. There's functionality that you use. But when it comes to this design language stuff,
we don't care.
Exactly. This is actually the perfect application for these, what other communities have referred to as kind of leaf components or, stateless components, or there's another term I can't think of right now. But basically, these kind of very dumb display-only presenter components that are just concerned with styles and spacing and things like that. So that I haven't played with as much yet, but I have an idea for how to get it into the stuff we're using, and I'm pretty excited about that. So yeah, there's a lot there. I think it's pretty exciting though, and it's definitely something I'm going to keep pursuing.
Yeah, it's awesome. I love I love HTML, I love CSS, I love JavaScript, and then working at the feature level, not thinking about those things is amazing.
Yep. Just like we don't have to think about how to add an event listener with Ember.
Yeah.
And we shouldn't have to.
Right.
You know? We should just think about a user clicking this and this thing happening. Like I think that's the right way to think about it. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff there. It'll be fun.
Nice.
So
we're gonna go over this in the training.
In the training, yep. So we're gonna work on some libraries. You know, between now and then, we're gonna work on our library, some other supporting libraries we have ideas for, and just basically lay out these principles, talk about why we find them compelling, what they enable too, because, you know, once you have, again, it's kind of like how Ember lets us build on these floors, and you're starting on the 20th floor, and then you get to see the 25th floor. And then when you go up to the 30th floor, you get to see the 35th floor. But way down here, you couldn't see it. But now that we have standardized UI components, it's like, well, why don't we get like an automated style guide from this?
Yep.
And why don't we have other templates where we show how these things work together? And we can even run tests against these things and make sure that they don't change and they don't break our designs, or that they work the way we expect. We could do static analysis on how many times they're being invoked in our app, so we can see if we have colors that aren't being used or certain variations of components that aren't being used. We could have a histogram to see if we're trying to say our site doesn't feel consistent design-wise, like there's spacing that's off. Maybe we're using too many spaces or too many shades of black, or all these kinds of things. There's really a lot of stuff it unlocks.
It's funny, as you're going down this list, these are all problems that we faced in the past year.
Yep.
And so it's like, yeah, I remember that.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. And, you know, obviously people have been facing and solving these problems up until now. If you have a knockout design team or designer on your team who's just focused on this and is really good about keeping a design language up to date in a style guide that developers actually use, and policing the site to make sure like it can work. But we want to make something that makes it easier to do it, where you don't have to have a
full-time person looking over this. And as soon as someone else, like if you've ever worked on a product that kind of has two different sections, maybe like an admin area and a front end, or two different admin areas, and they're owned by two different groups,
you're done.
Yeah, they'll try to share styles, and they will with good intentions, but someone is going to make some change, and it's only going to be in that part of the app, and it's inconsistent.
Yep.
So it's hard. You need that design person. They need like full control over the project.
Right.
Everyone needs to listen to them, and it's so hard to build an organization, to build a team that follows these rules. So,
absolutely.
So building these constraints in code is awesome.
Is a great way to solve the problem. So yeah, cool.
Nice.
Yeah, so UI components are pretty cool.
Yeah. I worked on a feature a few weeks ago where I wanted to test that when the route loaded data, the server would 500 and the page would display something like, hey, the site's down, or
so given a server that would 500, when I load the page and the route goes here and it gets a 500 response, then
I should see the error template.
I should see the error
and
template.
And this app I'm working on, there's a few different cases of this. One is like when I submit a form and the app is the back end is down, I should see an error. So how do you go about testing this? So
Mirage does let you define route handlers that respond with error codes. So 400, 500X, and gives you data. I've done it in development, and it would do it as you expect. So if you switched it over, if you just had a separate route handler and you made it 500, you could just play with it that way. But you want to write a test for it. So I remember when we dug into this, there's a couple of things that we found. First of all, if you're using the router and an error template, I think things actually just work. And I think what originally led to this was the fact that we were trying to test a failing form, which was like an Ember concurrency task. Mm-hmm. And what happened was when that task failed, the task submitted a request. Mirage responded with a 500, which caused Ember data to like throw an error.
Yep.
and the test went bad. Even though that was what we expected, and even though the interface properly responded to that, it was as if the exception was not handled, and so it basically broke the app or broke the test runner.
And I think even in the router we had this, we didn't have the error template.
Before we had the error template, we did a thing where, without the error template defined, we ran into the same behavior. And then once you actually define an error template, it changed the way Ember data behaved in test mode when we 500 the server. So that was interesting. There was a lot going on there. And so what we really want is a consistent way to do this, right?
Right.
If I have a 500, how can I say I expect there to be a 500? That's okay. Don't fail my test suite or don't stop running it.
Exactly. And starting from the kind of like working backwards, like starting from the ideal API, I have an acceptance test. I set up a Mirage route in that acceptance test. So I say like, server.post to comments 500.
Right.
And then I want to do something like, okay, visit this blog post, fill in the comment text area, click the submit button, and the app should throw an exception, and you should see this error rendered on the screen.
Right.
And that's like my ideal.
Right.
When I'm writing tests, I want to be thinking at that level.
Right. So that led us to work on this this async assertion called something like
I think it's like async throws.
Async throws. And this was inspired because there's something called assert.throws, which is part of QUnit, which works synchronously. So if you're writing synchronous code, you can do assert.throws, and then let's just say you invoke a function. If it throws
try to divide a number by 0.
Exactly.
You could wrap that in assert.throws.
Exactly. So assert.throws, you get a function body. You can do whatever you want. And then if that code that you do throws an exception, well, you expect it. And then there's also a way within assert.throws, the second parameter besides the function body is going to be the actual type of exception that was thrown. And you can assert against like the string representation. And that's good because if you're writing a test that says, okay, I would expect that this behavior would throw an exception, you want to make sure it's the right exception.
Yeah.
So it's not another thing that's wrong with your app. That's just getting swallowed by this assertion.
Right.
So that's a good practice for sync code. And so what we wanted was basically the same thing for async code.
Yep.
So we want to be able to say, given all this stuff, visit this, fill this in, and now I'm about to take an asynchronous step. So I'm about to use one of the test helpers, let's say.
When I click the save button.
When I click the save button. So what we do is we wrap it in async throws, assert.async throws. Within that function body, you can return an await for clicking the submit button. And then you can say, now here's what I would expect to show up in the console. Let's say the server 500. And what that helper does is something equivalent to try catch, where it's not going to break the app when there's an exception, if it matches what you
right.
What
I think we pass a string.
We pass a string.
The exception should match the string.
And we had to do something with the test logger.
So yeah, I think the exception that gets thrown isn't enough. You want to assert what gets sent to Ember's error logger because that has a more meaningful message.
Right.
So I think there was a situation where the exception was adapter error,
right,
but that wasn't telling us enough.
Right.
Where what got sent to the logger was like you tried to post to this endpoint and it returned to 500.
Right. So we had to be sneaky in this helper where we actually kind of temporarily overwrite the logger and the test.
There's something in QUnit that says if an exception is thrown, fail the test.
Right.
Because something went wrong.
It's not the Ember logger, it's the test.
It's a test exception.
Test exception
yeah,
something.
Test adapter exception handler.
Right.
So we override that, grab the exception, don't let it leave the test so we don't let QUnit fail. But then for the assertion,
make sure the assertion matches, the actual exception matches what you expect it to be.
That's where we sneak into the logger because we know the logger is going to get that message.
And then return out. And that way, if the exception is thrown again, you can keep going on your test.
Right.
And that was why some of those the error template was working and continuing on with the test, but the other errors weren't. It was a difference between the logger and the test adapter thing that was breaking the test suite.
And one really nice thing about this is that in QUnit, when you're like asserting exceptions and you're catching them and you're not letting them leave, you still get the error messages in the console. And they should be there because you did throw an error.
Right.
So you'd expect them there, but it's noisy because when you have a test that fails, or you're just watching your test run and you see all these exceptions, you're like, wait, am I supposed to see that? Or is that actually a problem?
Exactly.
And since we sneak into the logger to do the assertion, we can also stop that thing from
happening.
console. So when our tests are green, our console's
clean.
Yeah.
Basically,
that rhymes.
That's good too. If your tests are green, your console should be green. It should be clean.
Yeah.
Because this is also with deprecations, we've started basically saying deprecations are errors.
Yeah.
And if you see a CI build that has a deprecation warning, it's like that. You should think that as an error.
Yeah. That won't fail our CI,
Right.
but between us, we'll say this needs to get fixed.
Right. So that's really cool because then you can assert.async throws, do your thing, make sure it accepts. The exception happens, and then you can keep going and say, also make sure the screen is rendering something that says, "Uh-oh, your thing failed," so the user is not left in the dark.
And you can do some pretty fun stuff, right? You can say the first 2 times I hit save, it's going to fail, but then on the 3rd time, it's going to work. And
That's true.
You can write that all out, and it reads like a script.
Right.
I mean, it reads like you would describe it to someone.
Yep, because of the async await, and you can rewrite Mirage route handlers as much as you want.
Yep.
Try again, and now it works or whatever.
And this pattern, too, it works the same for like an Ember concurrency task that's running model.save, as well as a route.
A proper router exception that's thrown.
Yeah. So this is
error template or error action that's called. Yeah.
So right now, this is a helper in that we basically copy around. So it's in the Ember app that I'm working on now.
Right. We have a blog post coming with it describing all this.
Should we add on this? Like, should this be an add-on? How should this?
I wonder if this should be an add-on. It'd be nice to get the implementation blessed by, Robert or someone equivalent who has knowledge of QUnit and Ember's testing. Yeah. Right. So maybe first step, we just put it in a blog post, get it out there and see if it works for people. And then, it would be great to have it as an add-on. I mean, why not? Right.
Right.
So, we're using it on every time we do these kinds of tests. So, cool.
Nice.
All right. Well, Happy New Year, everyone. It's good to be back. 2018 is going to be a fun year for Ember. So, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Yeah. Bye.